Game loaded.
Program. This, I don't know how long it's going to take. This is going to be one, or perhaps several, game design streams done on the weekends. So I don't know, depending how popular they are, etc. So, what is the stream about? It's like game design, especially tabletop RPG design. I've been thinking about this idea for quite a while, and I thought, well, I could just keep thinking about it, or I could get to work on it. Might as well do it on stream. Maybe you're gonna mess it up. Might as well do it in public, right? 3980 is my idea. Right now, it's just an idea. About a retro futurism or cassette futurism style role playing game, tabletop role playing game. In it, you play a troubleshooter, which, if you know anything about, that's the title, working title of the type of character you can play. Remember the old TSR RPG, tabletop RPG, Star Frontiers. The name was also the one that was used for the characters there. You could be working for a government, or you could be working for private corporation, or on your own, on the contract. And you, put it bluntly, you shoot, you find trouble and you solve it. Often, depending on how the rules go, probably by shooting it, because this is a kind of an action RPG, so to speak. But hopefully, not such a way that requires you to always shoot things. So here we are. But first and foremost, we have to start with the premise. So let's start big picture, and then we're going to work in things. I talk about cassette futurism. What does that mean? Well, according to TV Tropes, it is, and I'm going to read it for you. It's a work created sometimes in the mid late 70s. It says the 70s, 80s, 90s, and occasionally the nils to 2000s. In fashion, architecture, and technology, we have a certain aesthetic, whether it be loud, bright colors or geometric shapes, a tendency towards dark plainness, or the lack lack of powerful computers and cell phones, or no cell phones whatsoever, although communicators might be a thing. It is clear that neither the ray gun Gothic, which is from 1920s to the 1950s, of days past, nor the everything is an iPod of the future, the 2000s, aesthetic that would follow, but a bridging point from the contains elements of both styles. Essentially, to define it, I'm going to put a link to this on the a link to a blog post that I made. Here you go. Here's the link. About cassette futurism. I explain in the post the following. I'm going to read it to you. Communicate across the known space through our proprietary PlanetServe system that provides VidPhone, electronic mail, and fax support for all the customers for a low price of 1 credit per hour. Listen to late synth hits in your portable high-density micro CD system that can carry whopping. It says whooping. It should be whopping. 80 megabytes of data per disk. Right. This is the kind of thing of, essentially, if I were to put it in a time frame. I studied history when I was in college, so I like to put things in history. It is science fiction of the late 20th century, particularly from 1979 to 1980, 1989. Hence the title, the 3980s, right? It's the far future of 3980. I didn't want to put it like in 2007 or 2020, something like that. Say like Cyberpunk, for example, 2020, 2019, because it's not near future, it's far future, right? It's this idea that how the far future will be seen from the lens of the 1980s. And this was, if you were coming from Man Squad and you seen shows like Nebula Jazz and particularly Mirror Shades, that is some of the some inspiration. Of course, I'm a child of the 80s. Yes, I know I'm that old, and therefore I remember all the anime, well, not so much manga, but certainly all the anime and the sort of direct to video, which used to be B movies, sci-fi shows and stuff like that. So that is the main focus, the overall focus. It's very much an aesthetic, and also games like Star Frontiers and Traveler and stuff like that. First of all, let's see the things that this game will not be, at least for now, anyway. It is not cyberpunk, although it has elements of that aesthetic. One could argue that cassette futurism, cyberpunk, is within that aspect of cassette futurism, one of the subgenres. One way to look at it, but you gotta be careful with that. Cyberpunk is kind of predates this term by a lot. It is also not a mech giant robot RPG, right? There's plenty of those BattleTech. Warhammer has aspects of that, and some others, Mechton, that sort of thing. So there's plenty of those. I don't want to rehash that. In tonight's stream, and I guess I don't know how long it's going to be. We're basically going to talk about premise, because before you get to mechanics, before you get to what types you're going to use, how to create characters, villains, scenarios, maps, the math, all those things, you have to narrow down the premise. And this is already a relatively wide premise, because it takes 10 years and thousands of movies and stuff like that. So, and even when you look at the discussion, it's like, wow, that's a lot of ground to cover. It's more narrow than many sci-fi RPGs, but still probably not narrow enough. So let's look at the history of the 1980s, especially sci-fi, and what motivated a lot of the sci-fi things. I'm going to narrow to three things, right? At least the way I see them. Well, first of all, the Cold War. Second, three things. I'll just do a list of three. And I'll to shrink this stuff. I put in this big block letter so you guys can see it. And you can't, because I put the camera in the wrong place. So let me put it here. Then I don't know wherever I put it's gonna be, but it's certainly gonna be a problem. So let's bump up the size of this 28 so you guys can see it better. So three historical things that affect the tone and the aesthetic, the themes, tone, and aesthetic. Affect the themes, yes, aesthetic, theme, and tone of the game. I mean, you can talk about a lot of these things, but since I like to talk about it in terms of history, the way we talk about fantasy RPGs and being based on Western mythology, particularly classical Mediterranean mythology, and then of course later on Western European history and mythology. This is kind of the same way. So three things. The first would be the consumer electronics, which, as the name suggests, you have your cassette futurism, right? It's things like digital displays, home computers, VCR, home electronics. I'm gonna put it home electronics and appliances, as well as video games, and electronics, video games, and early computer graphics. Right. This is very much aesthetic. The look and feel of this game. If you were a GM describing, a place, you would talk about. You wouldn't talk about flat screens. You might talk about hollow screens and holograms because there were plenty of them there, but you mostly would talk about things like CRTs and big, and vector graphics and stuff like that. So think Rogue One, for example, how they try to recreate the vision of the original Star Wars and the series, but particularly the original Star Wars was 1977. But remember, Star Wars, the two other movies were in the 1980s. That is, you had 1980, you had Empire Strikes Back. In 1983, you had Return of the Jedi. So while the movie started in the 70s, and you can tell by the haircut, specifically in 1977, the Star Wars, it's most of it was in 1980. So you would have stuff like that. I think consumer electronics is very interesting because I talk about home electronics. We're talking about VCRs. We're talking about stuff like watches, stuff like this. Stuff, Casio watches, Casio keyboards, that sort of thing. It became cheap because of the integrated circuit, also known as the microchip, and home computers and PCs. Home computers fall under PC, but I'm not going to get into a discussion of the differences between them. For the first time, you had home electronics being pervasive during the home, throughout the home, and it gave a sense, kind of like the 1950s, that the future wasn't there yet, but it was around the corner, right? A lot of this stuff now looks way primitive, but back then it was like you could imagine almost anything, and it fired up the imagination of a lot of writers, especially William Gibson, for example, and his discussions about and writing about, say, what would become the internet. Of course, the thing that he was missing was the World Wide Web. So there's that. And I'm supposed to change this. Let's see if that works now. You really don't have to see my ugly mug, but there you go. So when you're describing the interior of ships and you're describing all kinds of things, think of that aesthetic, right? There's other elements as well. For example, we'll get into that in a little bit, but sort of that's a key of that. Then you have the Cold War, and I think that binary, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism, I think that's of course misspelled, so that's what we have. Or perhaps I want to put it this way. Black and white morality. We're going to start using tropes. And by the way, this game is going to be troperific. It's going to be all about the tropes. So we're going to be talking about tropes from now until, well, whenever. Black and white morality. there was the 1980s. The Cold War had not ended, although it would end in 1989. But and you don't really have to directly reference the Cold War. But one of the things about the Cold War, and I think it's theme, close to theme perhaps, theme and tone. Let's leave theme. Let's leave it a theme. It's the fact that you have good guys and bad guys, right? Throughout the 1980s, again, because in part they were trying to evoke the sense of the 1950s, you had very good guys and very bad guys, right? The heroes were the heroes, the bad guys were the bad guys. There was an attempt to bring that sort of McKinnian worldview back into the forefront. And that was a reaction to, and I'm going to bring this very specifically, the Vietnam War slash counter culture, which I think goes to tone to a certain degree. Ultra violence, drugs, actually designer drugs and space drugs, drugs slash drug war, and greater and sexual content. Although, there was ambivalence to that. Why do I mention the Vietnam War and counterculture? I mention them because while the idea was to sort of bring back the 1950s, one of the reasons that was depending on the Reagan in the United States and Thatcher in Britain. At the same time, you had the 1960s and the 1970s that were turbulent years, especially in the West, and you had, in particular, the United States had the Vietnam War, and so that introduces a sense of cynicism, right? And so, in the 1980s, you felt that you couldn't, especially Hollywood, could not put the genie back into the bottle, even societies that were not as shaken up by the counterculture, such as Japan, kind of embraced the ultraviolence and the blood, especially in anime. Really went at it, as well as sex as well, mostly nudity of women, but also in the United States. But mostly when we talk about nudity, we're talking about boobs and butts on women for the most part, not full far nudity in that. No, you can't do that. In Europe, that's different, but in America and Japan, some other places, it was ultra violence, right? And in video games as well, one could argue. And that served as a sort of tonal counterpoint to the Cold War, right? You have you have these three visions that come together, and I think that goes to tone, although it could be also theme. So these are interchangeable. You had, on one hand, you had the 1980s, where depending on the year, were 20, 15, 10 years away from the turn of the century, would be the turn of the millennium, the 21st century, the future. Kind of in a way felt like probably people felt at the end of the 19th century when they see, industrial revolution. But now the end of the industrial revolution combined with the incoming information age had come to the home. So now it wasn't just computers somewhere. Oh, there's computers. No, literally, you could have a computer on your desk in your room, or on an Apple II, a Commodore 64, a Specky for for people from Britain know what I'm talking about. You can have that. So there's hope. And a bit of hope and danger, robots and stuff like that. People could actually buy a kit and make their own computers in 1970s and even 80s. They could make some robots. They were actually kits that you could buy. About $500, you could find like a kit of a robot that was basically kind of like a garbage can or a garbage bin with an arm. Robot arms. And the Radio Shack was very popular in the 1980s, and other electronic toys. You think about the NES, for example, that came with Roby the Robot, right? A little robot thing that was supposed to be a toy. It didn't do much, but again, it's that aesthetic, that idea, and I think that puts people in the mindset of the future, which this week in sci-fi RPG fits very well. The Cold War, you don't have to have Cold War scenarios necessarily in your video games. Great power blocks, fun, and there isn't really one, at least not in the beginning. And we'll talk about the setting itself, and probably in some future stream. But right now we're just talking about premise here. But it does, the Cold War presented the idea that there were these bad guys, right? These absolute bad guys, and therefore we, who are and tribalism and all that, are good guys. But that was tempered with a sense of cynicism. Right? So you look at a lot of movies in the 1980s, the heroes might, some heroes, not all of them, in many ways, how it was that you always had at least one hero. Well, look at Star Wars. You know, you have the hero that is hopeful, right? That's Luke Skywalker, and you have the cynical hero in the form of Han Solo, and then in the middle you have Princess Leia, right, who kind of represents the good old days and the past and all that, but she's also a fighter and stuff like that. And Star Wars has all, and this 1970s, and it will continue in 1980s and beyond. That's a lot of ultra violence. I mean, Aunt Beru and Uncle Owen ended up as burning skeletons in the middle of the desert. I mean, literally, Luke Skywalker looks at them, and the two humans we see aside from Luke Skywalker, and there were no more other humans in the ranch with them, and you see the burning skeletons in the desert. So that means that the stormtroopers dragged them out of their homes, threw them on the ground, probably their corpses, or shot them right there. Catharsis, best part, and set them on fire. So yeah, ultra violence in a kids movie, right? How you doing? We're talking about video game. We're talking about game design here, and tone and all that, and the premise of my now coming well working RPG. So you have these three that they have so sweet mood swings, but often what happens in movies like Star Wars and some others is that at the end of the day the heroes do win, and so they hope to restore order and restore that sense of right bad guys versus good guys versus bad guys, that sort of Machiavellian worldview, moral view. But in the process, there's a lot of violence and explosions and people dying and getting burned to death. And clearly the bad guys are going to be horrible. But even the good guys can be, shall we say, exactly. But the heroes don't shy away from doing horrible things as well. I mean, remember Obi-Wan Kenobi just ripped out someone's arm. And you see their arm flop into the ground and it's bloody and all that. It's an alien arm, but he did it with his laser sword, right? It's just that the bad guys are more evil and they don't seem to have principles other than greed and thirst for power. So these are the three pillars of the universe, the themes of the universe of this game and of the 1980s. Yeah. Beyond the aesthetic, there's that. But there's more to it than that. And we're going to go to two things, two other influences: class, as in social class, and music. I talked about the aesthetic before about cassette futurism, but I have a particular view of what I want. One of the things I want is I want to sort of stratified and simplify, stratified into three groups, like the rich and ultra rich live in a world where, if you ever seen Sid Mead's types of Sid Mead is a he's still alive. He's one of the kind of a kind of guy who did a lot of futurism stuff in 1970s, 80s, and even today. I'm gonna link you to some of the pictures. I'm gonna see if I can if I have one that I can put here in the document. Let me see. Let me insert. Let me see if I have a picture that can go with it. These are, by the way, I'm using them as best I can, of course, because well, I don't have permission to. They're not going to be in the finally published document because I don't have permission to use any of them. So you got to give credit where credit's due. And let's see if I have one on Seed Meats examples of the type of buildings and space stations and the like. I don't think I have one, but I have them on. I have so much. I have so much. I keep saving stuff. Like I keep putting up. Okay, let me put it this simple. If you played Mass Effect, the original Mass Effect, the look of the Citadel and some of the buildings and cities and stuff like that, that's evoking Sid Mead. Okay, this is a good one. Let me put it this way. Let me expand it a little bit. This is not Sid Mead's work, but I think you'll see what I'm talking about. It's a bit diffused, but this would be something like this, right? Late 1970s, early 1980s. Think Star Trek the movie, which came out also in 1980 as well. Um, that particular movie, because later on they get a little darker, and earlier on it's pretty much 1960s anyway, so it doesn't work. So this would be like clean spaces, a lot of white, a lot of glass. You have here electronics. Let me see if I can get another picture, because this one is not very clear. Integrated into things. Let me see if we can insert another. Okay, let me save this one. I'm gonna copy it. I'm gonna put it on the doobly-doo. There's that link, but so that you guys can see it on screen, I'm gonna put it here. I'm gonna save it. Save it, save it. Also, I'm gonna use it as reference later, so might as well, right? Tabularific. So you can see that. That's in the ultra rich, right? The ultra rich live in clean space. They live in O'Neill cylinders, space stations, and stuff like that. If you've seen Gundam, the original Gundam, the space stations that they drop from orbit, the colony drop, that's an O'Neill cylinder. The sort of cylindrical space stations. Think Epcot Center, especially the world of tomorrow, the part of the world tomorrow. Let me just erase that and insert another picture. I think it's clearer. So you guys can see what I'm talking about. Okay, well, here we go. Yeah, I already had a picture for this. This, I think it's a best picture for it. You guys can see it on chat. And yes, you can. Let me get my face out of the way. There. That is sort of the aesthetic of people who are very rich in this universe, right? Music wise, if you were to think music, I would think electro swing, right? And evoking the past and stuff like that. That would be the thing. As you go down the line, the middle class has a different aesthetic. So let's put it in a document. Ultra rich, clean spaces, clean verdant spaces, plus electro swing music. Evocation of the past, clear control of their spaces. These are rich people that can build anywhere and do anything. The middle class, it's more. Let's see what if I have an example of what the middle class would be. Insert another picture here. Would be closer to how people lived in the 1980s, but with some doodads and gadgets that they would be closer to the cassette futurism kind of thing. That they would live in apartments, they would live in homes. Their spaces and cities and the like would be more close to the 1980s, but a little more advanced. I don't know. Well, this is a good one. This is from, although it's a little more advanced, it's from The Expanse, as you can see in the corner here. All rights, copyrights that go to the fans and their art, right? Somewhat crowded but clean, still clean places. People using bicycles, using like that, like basic home electronics, uh, but a little more crowded. They had to share more space. Um, so it would be apartments, buildings, and mid and suburbs. Maybe the occasional farm plus farms and suburbs, suburbs, farms, technology would be would be more functional instead of being it'll be more function over form, where in the rich people will be form over function. And the music would be a mix of future pop based on 1980s plus synth wave, lighter chill wave, not synth wave, chill wave. I think I have an example of chill wave for you guys to listen to, um, so you can get an idea what I'm talking about. So, chill wave mix. Also, I mean, after all, if and why I'm using music, because if you're playing the game, this is kind of the music like, oh, you're going to a middle class space and stuff like that. This is the thing. And finally, you have working class or lower class, working class um, stuff. And this is where I think I'm gonna grab a lot of aesthetics from cyberpunk. Very industrial, very much. I hope you can. I'm talking to the mic. I forget and keep talking away from the mic, and this mic is not the best. So, um, very industrial, very crowded, cyberpunkish. Again, not necessarily in theme, so that those themes are still there, or can be touched upon, but rather, more brutal, crowded spaces. A lot of synthetic food. Um, living by extremes, that kind of thing. Um, if we're going to give you another series of examples, think about cyberware, right? Someone who is rich probably has, clone tissue parts and stuff like that in this universe, wherein someone who is very poor and can get a substitute for an arm or something like that, they probably have something that's very crude cyberware. You can actually see the gears spinning and stuff like that. Cables, the works, right? Let me give you. I think I can find something. Well, that's a bit too much, but actually, this would be kind of like cables everywhere, stuff like that, right? Very brutal. The eye, this is clearly cybernetics, and it goes to that. So, based on all this, what would be the role of the characters? Well, I'm not getting much into characters, but what would you be doing in this universe? Well, as troubleshooters, you will be working for the government, or in this case, the biggest government, or any government, but this called the Soul Consortium. And you will be special agents for the government, right? Troubleshooters. If I can come up with a better title, or chat can suggest a better title, so be it. And troubleshooters go around the galaxy, or at least the corner of the galaxy that the action takes place, in the year 3980, and solve problems. If you ever watch the, for a more comedic but also kind of violent show, a lot of anime, well, it's like Super Agent Cobra or the Dirty Pair type of comic books and manga and anime, kind of like that, right? And similar situations in the special agents, and so that is the kind of thing that would go with the premise, right? The a situation where you have corporate interest and personal interest and um, societal into sort of clashing together, and the characters have to sort of navigate to that, usually by shooting somebody in the face, or punching them in the face, or taking them down in some kind of way. I think that would be the overall premise. So the premise is, once again, a RPG designed to emulate sci-fi of the 1980s, some anime that is not giant robot based, and sci-fi action flicks of the 1980s, particularly sort of straight to video stuff, like some of the Van Damme movies. I forgot he had one called Cyborg. Well, that was post-apocalyptic, but it's kind of like that. You can grab stuff from even some cyberpunky stuff, like from Terminator, especially the first one. The music of the Terminator would be a great a great background music to that. I think overall, if you're gonna do the music for like just running a particular adventure, it would be certainly be synthwave, especially the darker synthwave. You have a sense like, and GM would, the adventures would have to be a mixture of heroes, fighting a villain, particular villain, something like that. Listen, we talk about premise, and we talk about heroes and villains. Might as well jump into that because I think we have, well, that's an animated gift, and it's terrifying. I said before that they are heroes and villains. One of the things about the premise of this game is that one should avoid having the heroes, the player characters, they act, how heroic they act is entirely up to them. Face or confront faceless villains and faceless organizations and forces. Okay, no, that's one note, maybe for the future, but give a face to the enemy. And this is a constant of those movies. Like, there is a villain. You're going to have villains. You can be cynical, you can be ultra violent, but you're gonna need a face, right? Whether they're fighting, a mega corporation, or an evil tyrannical government, or a a science gone mad experiment, an alien race, there is always needs to be a face to that villain, right? Because that's typical of the movies, right? The typical of this time is that you have villains and villains need to be defeated. Now, mind you, the problem can continue, right? They defeat one villain and there's like a ton of them that go beyond that. But that villain needs to have a face to be defeated, either immediately or at some point in the future, right? Otherwise, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? You gotta give a face to a villain. That's also, I think, part of the premise as well, that you're facing concrete enemies at any one point. Often you can play the alien thing. Even in Aliens particularly, there's an alien. In the original Alien, there was an alien, and in Aliens, there was a clear villain in the form of, well, multiple, but one of them was the head of the corporation, the guy who was running the corporation that Ridley worked for. He was just a jackass. And then you have the alien queens, the one that gets burned, and the one that, that famous scene where Ripley gets into the power loader and just goes at it against the queen, the second queen that bursts out of the chest of the robot, the synthetic, right? You need a villain, you need a face. That's, for example, going back to Mass Effect, you have Saren in the first game. Saren is the face of the villain. Yeah, you have Sovereign coming in. It's a giant ship and it's cyborg and it's going to blow up everything. But really, you fight Saren. Saren serves the purpose of being the face that you can defeat. So that's also very important to the premise. So we have right now. We talked about. Let's do a little recap. We talked about influences and the history of the aesthetic, where it comes from. We talked about social class and how important that is to the game. And we also talked about giving faces to the enemy, right? It's that is part of the McKinnian thing of like fighting good versus evil. The heroes might be damaged. The heroes might be um, cynical and even violent, but they're the heroes. You have because here you have heroes and villains clearly. If for no other reason that the villains are always almost much worse than the heroes, right? Now, I want to make a note because it is sort of retro 1980s stuff about sex and gender and sexual representation and all that. Mind you, in 1980s, especially in sci-fi, it was not unusual to have women, especially in RPGs, be represented, but not in the same way that it is today. The idea of sexual liberation, as it were, usually meant liberating women from their clothing and liberating women from their inhibitions and liberating their allow their libidos to flourish. That might not be the kind of game you want to play, right? It is part of the setting, as it were, or it can be as part of the setting as much as you want it to, but that does not mean that you have to conform to the gender and social expectations of the 1980s to make it realistic. This is sci-fi. This is fiction. This is your game. You don't have to do that. So I'm going to put that as a note, part of the premise. You do not have to conform to perceived notions of sex, gender, race, or ethnicity based on ideas about historical accuracy. If anything, one could argue because this is sci-fi, a lot of the stuff applies, and fiction applies the way you want to apply it, both individually and also as a group. Right, so at no point should any character say, "Oh, I can't play the female because the heroes of these movies were male," stuff like that, or I can't play a trans character, or I can be gay. You're gay, and that is fact. I put in the premise because I want that to be part of the discussion from the get go. And we get to the part about the discussion. Now I'm going to talk about world building, and then I talked a little bit about world building, but I'm going to talk about more in a future stream, and the streams are probably going to be short. But one of the things I wanted to say is that whenever this game comes out, one of the things that is very important is that should be also part of the premise as well. Probably the last part, but in fact should be the first one. Cart before the horse, I suppose. This is a work in process. In progress is the conversation. What do I mean by that? If you come from a mass squad, if you heard Adam talk about these things, you know what I'm talking about. But if you're not familiar with the term in RPG terms, let me introduce it to you. The conversation essentially is the game. In other words, the rules here, and I hope the rules actually encourage this, but and that's going to be one of the goals and one of the reasons why I'm doing it on stream. But I want to encourage conversation, even have a session 0, and while there will be a setting, because it's very specific, I'm going to have a setting and I'm going to do world building and all that, and I'm going to show you, probably going to do the document first and show you how I go through this, and things that can be changed and stuff like that. That's one part which I'm much of a lore monger, so yeah, I have this setting down, don't worry about it. But even that, the specifics of that setting and what applies to your group or doesn't, including what I mentioned about sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and all that, that is part of the conversation. The first thing that the players should do is take the given premise and adapt it as a group. I would encourage any person who wants to run a game, this game or any other game, but particularly this game. And that probably is going to be the opening paragraph of the document, any document I write, official document, will be about the conversation. What do I mean by that? You approach your players, say, "Oh, I heard about this cool, retro futuristic '80s theme sci-fi one-page document or two-page document thing. I'd like to try it out." Okay, cool. And they're gonna ask you, and the players are gonna ask you questions, and that's when the conversation starts. But what's important about the conversation, and it cannot be the conversation. Again, big letters, cannot or should not be the GM dictating to their, I don't know who might be GM in this, so let's not misgender anybody up front, to their players. In other words, you sit down, you start talking about, like, just like we're talking now about premise and stuff like that. You sit down, okay, this is influenced by Blade Runner. Has influences in Star Wars and Aliens and Dirty Pair and all those things. You know, we're influenced by all those things. So you guys have an idea. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe I want to play Cyborg. Oh, I mean, because I'm not gonna put rules for power armor, at least not, or particularly cybernetics and stuff like that. I mean, they're in the universe, or giant robots, but that doesn't mean that what if somebody wants to play giant robot? Actually, literally play the giant robot, right? Or want to play a robot? No, that should be part of the conversation. What if somebody says, oh, maybe we have cybernetics, which include the ability to be literally gender fluid? Like you could, I don't know. I'll give you an example, a video game example. The Saints Row series, especially Saints Row 3 and 4. Like, you can literally have a male character walk into a clinic and come out, presenting female. In fact, there's a mission in Saints Row 3 in which doesn't matter who you are, a male character, a female character, they always go into the clinic and they get transformed into a male character for story reasons. So if that's what you want, I mean, hey, you can literally have a cyborg which only has their brains on it and have a completely synthetic body. You have cloning, stuff like that. Why not? So the first thing that, well, there is a premise to the game. Cassette futurism, there's a premise in the sense of cybernetics and space travel and laser guns and plasma. So we're going to go with plasma technology for almost everything. And alien races and stuff like that. All that is a foundation to the conversation, but the conversation is about you and your players talking to each other and listening to each other. So that thing that's extremely important. Other things about this setting, again, I'm going to go world building a little later. This being just the first stream. I also have to take all this and reduce it to a font because it's much larger so it can be seen on screen. This is also very troperific, like I said earlier. It's driven by tropes. So character types are driven by tropes. Ideas are driven by tropes. It's about taking stuff that you already know or think you know and just running with it, right? This game was going to be kind of D&D in space, but we've seen that before. And in fact, right now, a very popular game called Starfinder is out there. I'm certainly not going to compete with that, nor should I. That thing just keeps creeping me out. And thus, it's gonna have some elements of that. You're gonna have your space elves and you're not space dwarves necessarily, but they're probably gonna be space orcs. But we'll see to that when we go to the races and all stuff like that. So that's the premise, right? And there's a reason why I started with this as a final note, and I like to thank Adam Jensen. Been playing way too much Deus Ex Human Revolution. Adam Coble. because when I started, it started many years back as an idea to creating an RPG for Mass Effect, a tabletop RPG for Mass Effect. Then it became an idea for a generic RPG. Then it became an idea for a generic fantasy RPG, and finally, as I listened to what he had to say and some of the things, he said, "You know what? Think of ideas first. Think of premise first. Make an RPG for and the rules for it for very specific purposes." And they said, "Well, I like the 80s. I like the sci-fi thing, so I'm going to do that." So that's why we started with premise. So, chat, if you have any suggestions or any questions, I think, well, you're always welcome to do that. I don't know. I'm going to try to have this be a regular thing on the weekends. Don't know if I can always make it on Saturdays though, because that's usually when I play my IRL tabletop RPG group. But if I can, I will. If not, on Sundays. I know it's being shorter than usual. I usually go for 2 to 3 hours. But right now, I don't know what I can add. And 90s. In fact, I can add to it. But I'd like to thank everybody who showed up. Probably the next stream is going to be longer, hopefully. Have more content. I'm also going to take an opportunity to tell you what's coming up this week, if you're interested. This week, I finished Deus Ex Human Revolution Director's Cut Friday, which means on Monday, I don't really have much. I'm going to probably be doing Capcom's D&D brawlers, which are Tower of Doom and Shadows of a Mystara. I have those, so probably I'm gonna play them on Monday. I may even do a short stream on Sunday, just to fill in some space. To be announced when exactly. And on Tuesday, and this is very important, at least if I can do it earlier, I can do it, but certainly at 8 o'clock, I'll be starting Neverwinter Nights Enhanced Edition, unless there's a major problem downloading it for some reason. And I'm going to be playing the heck out of that until Battletech, another 1980s inspired sci-fi, in this case mecha game, comes down. So that's what's coming up this week, starting tomorrow, Sundays. Week starts on Sundays. So Catharsis and everyone else who's been joining us, thank you for being here. And I hope you have a good evening. If for some reason I feel like playing something tonight, I might just start up again. But for now, I'd like to thank you for coming, for supporting the the stream. And I'm gonna repeat that link to the blog post that I wrote about cassette futurism, because I think it's also important you guys can get the thinking behind what I'm trying to do here. So, and this probably is gonna be one of those that it's gonna go on YouTube as well. I haven't posted anything on YouTube in a while because, well, YouTube and I are not getting along. So thank you all for coming, and I'll see you when I see you. Bye.